Hi, welcome to Gospel with Greg, and in the video today I'm going to be addressing the question of what if religious people have hurt me. And so what this is going to speak to is the situation of, there are a lot of people that have ill opinions of Christianity because of how they've been treated by people that say they're Christians, or maybe they have a bad experience with a church they went to. Maybe the leadership even treated them very poorly, and so they kind of quit going to church altogether, and they just have a bad view of Christianity because of that. I've heard people say that before of, if you bring up Christianity, it's like, oh, I don't want anything to do with that. I know how those Christians act. And so that's what I want to speak to in this video, that situation. And this can be a tough issue, and it can take so many different forms of depending on what the person has been through. I have some experience with this in terms of being, I'm trying to think of a good way to say it, but I've had situations before where maybe someone who said they were a Christian, or I was someone I knew in church, would say something that I thought was cruel, or they would put me in an awkward situation. Nothing too bad, and I praise God for the church I go to now, so definitely not trying to speak ill of my current church. Love it. And definitely love several other churches I've visited. I've visited and went to numerous different churches throughout my life, different places I've lived or different places I visited. And, throughout all those different churches and everything, there have been, some, very few, but still real situations where I would have very awkward run-ins with certain people, things they would do, or cruel things said to me, like I said. So I do have a little bit of experience with it, because sometimes, even if it was just temporary, like, I do not want to come back here. But ultimately, I know people have been through a lot worse than what I have experienced myself. And so the reason I'm making this video isn't because I've been through it, so badly, and, want to speak from my experience. But instead, the reason I want to make this video is because I think there are just a lot of Christians that don't handle these situations very well, where, if they are interacting with someone who was hurt in church and they quit going to church, I think that, I'm not saying all Christians or a majority or anything like that, but I just think there are a lot of Christians that just don't handle those situations very well. I've seen it happen before where that subject might come up of, people who have been hurt in church and they leave, and the Christian in the situation will be like, oh, well, I'm sure they've messed up your order at a restaurant, but you go back there. You shouldn't give up on God like that, or and so that's what a lot of, at least some Christians will say when they are presented with a situation like that. And I think that can backfire, because if someone has been in a situation where, and of course myself as a Christian, I think if someone's been wronged in church, I don't think that the best action is to just don't go to any churches anymore, anywhere ever, or don't be a Christian anymore. I don't think that's the right response. But if somebody has been through something really traumatic from a certain church they went to, I think that if what they are offered by a Christian that they bring that up to, if what they're presented with is, oh, well, you shouldn't generalize. You keep going back to the grocery store when they mess something up, or a restaurant or whatever, they're going to feel attacked. And, and then they might say, oh, well, see, you're just another one of them, you're proving my point. And then the Christian gets, defensive, and it becomes this like spiritual ping pong match where it's just like back and forth, and it just becomes a fight. And the person walks away from the situation just feeling, not only did they not change their mind and say, oh, I should get back in church, but they might feel even stronger. See, I know now more than ever I shouldn't go back to church. And so I think that as Christians, when we are speaking with people who have been through things like that, that have been hurt in church or by people who said they were Christians, while it might be tempting for us to get defensive, because we might have that feeling of, oh, they're attacking my way of life, I think that we do need to keep some things in mind, and that, particularly if the person has really faced something really traumatic, we shouldn't just breeze over that and tell them that they're generalizing too much. I think if they have been through something serious, it's good for us as Christians to affirm that, yeah, what the story you just mentioned about what that person in church did to you, that is terrible, and so, it can be good for us to affirm that, and, that will, that can help with the interaction going forward, that the person feels like, even though this Christian and I disagree on some things, clearly they can understand that this was a tough situation for me. And so when it comes to what about the part of the person that has been wronged in church, like what about that side? So something that I want to offer with that, of if somebody has been very hurt in church, is something I dealt with as a kid. That's kind of an analogy. It was called white coat syndrome. So I've mentioned on the channel before that I had a lot of health issues as a kid, and thankfully those are a lot better now, but I had to have a lot of surgeries growing up, and I was in the hospital quite a lot. And even though that helped me, as a little kid, it can be traumatic, getting all these shots, and, hospitals can seem scary and all that. And so it can be possible to develop this mentality of, you see a hospital as the scary place, and, when you see things that remind you of it, that can, create some angst. And so with this white coat syndrome, if I would go out into public and I would see maybe someone with scrubs on, maybe if I was in the grocery store and I saw a woman who was wearing like nursing scrubs, I would freak out because it reminded me of the hospital where, I got all those shots and those things. But as I got older, I realized, it wasn't accurate for me to draw that parallel of, because of that traumatic experience I went through, it wasn't right for me to have a negative reaction, to all physicians or nurses or whatever that, maybe had never even met me or dealt with me before. And, the situation, and I'm not saying the people that treated me in the hospital were cruel to me. That's not what I'm saying at all. But again, those shots and all that kind of stuff, very unpleasant in general, even if it is necessary, especially to a kid. But I learned as I got older that, the answer wasn't necessarily to convince myself that the situation wasn't traumatic, but I needed to change my perspective of, was very unfortunate what I went through, and I can definitely see how, when I was a little kid that would be traumatic. But ultimately, the issue wasn't the hospital staff, it was the medical issues. And so that's important in this situation because, if somebody goes to a church and you have people that gossip about you and, make things up about you or say cruel things to you, which unfortunately can happen sometimes in some churches, not all of them, and that's very important to remember, but sometimes people find themselves in those situations. Ultimately, the problem is those people, those specific people doing that. The issue isn't God. The issue isn't the Bible. The issue isn't churches in general. And so that kind of leads into something important, which is that not all people who say they're Christians are Christians. And so Jesus talks about that in Matthew chapter 7, verses 21 through 23. He says, "Not everyone who saith unto me, Lord, Lord, shall enter into the kingdom of heaven, but he that doeth the will of my Father which is in heaven. Many will say to me in that day, Lord, Lord, have we not prophesied in thy name, and in thy name have cast out devils, and in thy name done many wonderful works? And then will I profess unto them, I never knew you, depart from me, ye that work iniquity." And so Jesus right here tells us that not everybody who says they're a Christian or claims to follow him is a Christian. And I think that there's this tendency in our world today of, if you just say you're a Christian, it's kind of just taken at face value. If you say you believe in God or you believe in Jesus, that, to the world, okay, you're a Christian. Well, the Bible tells us even the devil believes in God. And so when it comes to, what makes someone a Christian? Well, Jesus said it there of, you don't just say you believe in him. You don't just say you follow him, but do you do the will of God? And the Bible also tells us about the fruit of the Spirit, because if you're a genuine Christian, if you're saved, you have the Spirit of God that lives in you, and the Spirit bears fruit. So we read about the fruit of the Spirit in the New Testament. And so, that kind of shows us that, that's kind of outward evidence of our faith in our actions. And so, I think in a lot of situations, even though it's hard to kind of generalize, people can be hurt in so many different ways, but, there are times where people might be hurt by people who say they're Christians that aren't actually Christians. It kind of something that kind of just came to me is, imagine there is, and this might seem like a trivial example, but I think it illustrates the point, is imagine there's a business, say a restaurant, and this is just an amazing, great restaurant, but I dress up like an employee. I don't actually work there, but I, get my hands on an employee uniform. I sneak in, I'm dressed like a waiter, and I walk over to your table and I start harassing you and, and rubbing my hands in your food and all that. That's very rude and grotesque of me. But if you say, you're not going back to that restaurant because, I know how those people are, well, you're judging the restaurant based on somebody who's not affiliated with the restaurant. They tricked you into thinking they were, but they weren't actually. And so the good thing about this situation with God and his word and what it means to be a Christian is God tells you and I, what makes someone a Christian and how to tell, what's the evidence of that. And last big thing I'll cover is that Jesus was treated badly by religious people too. Jesus had, these exchanges with the Pharisees where they were very cruel to him and, ultimately pushed for him to be crucified. And so, we hear about that in things like Matthew chapter 14, where they ask Jesus, if he's the Christ, the Son of the Blessed. And he says that he is, and they push for him. They call him a blasphemer, and they push for him to be crucified, and ultimately that happens. And that kind of goes back to the previous thing I just said of not everybody who claims to represent God does. The Pharisees, they absolutely, they were religious leaders. They were considered religious leaders, and they would have definitely told you they represented God. But Jesus made it very clear of no, not really, they didn't. And so, and Jesus and the Bible talks about, the topic of, religion and religious people, and will use it in a negative term. To follow Christ and to be a religious person according to the Bible are very different things. The Pharisees were very much religious people that were self-righteous. So, the title of this video, What If Religious People Have Hurt Me? That's a very fitting title. Because if they're acting like the Pharisees, they don't really represent God, even if they say they do. And so, overall, if we're wronged by people who claim to be Christians or by a church, those feelings might be completely legitimate, but we have to remember that ultimately we don't follow the Pharisees. We follow Christ. And ultimately, when we are in situations where people wrong us like that, we're wronged in a church, it can be, it can lead to all these emotions. But ultimately, if we react to that in a way of, I'm not going to church anymore, I'm not serving God anymore, in that situation, we're giving authority to those people, authority we should be giving to God. We're saying to them, I'm going to let you, somebody who wronged me, determine what I do with my life. I'm going to let you determine not only where I go on Sunday, but my worship and my lifestyle, my ideals, my morals. And, no other person in this world deserves that amount of authority over your life. And we ultimately need to give that authority to Christ, who's perfect and who has been through that himself. And ultimately, remember that if you're a Christian and you are dealing with some of that now, and you kind of have this feeling of, I just don't want anything else to do with this, just remember that Christ went through it himself first, and when you serve him, he's on your side. So I really hope that this was helpful, especially to anyone who is dealing with something like this or has dealt with something like this. So until next time, God bless.